first of all, I want to really thank you for giving us the time to review your book, Co-Creating Change. And so we started a group of Israeli therapists that is meeting every 2 weeks, and through the translation of the book that hopefully will be ready, finish in a few days. And each time we review a chapter and also do peers supervision through video cases. And we are really fortunate and grateful to have you with us. And I just want to ask you, and really is interesting to hear what brought you to write this wonderful book. Like, what were your thoughts and writing this really detailed and really feeling like going to the core of psychotherapy through co-creating change?
Well, my previous training was as a child. I worked in my father's blacksmith shop. And so other kids had a childhood. I worked in his shop every weekend. I worked in his shop every summer. So I was really trained in a craft. And in a craft, you learn from the teacher what to do. He says, watch me, now you do it. No, not quite right. Watch me again, do it. And so there's a very hands-on kind of teaching and learning a craft. And then later I, became a professional musician, and there again, the teacher will play for you. You have certain exercises. There's a systematic way of teaching, very detailed. An A major chord, so it needs to be a little lower in order to be in tune. There's very specific, detailed suggestions one gets about technique in order to make a great art. And so later in life, when I was training as a therapist, I was really struck how vague most supervision would be. People would say, well, you just need to earn the patient's trust, or you have to log more hours. Or you just have to let the relationship build. These are very vague kinds of instructions, but there was no really specific technical advice being given, no real sense of how a theory would translate into practice. And I was very struck, and I think my supervisors found me a little difficult initially because I kept asking questions, but what would you do? What would you say here? Yeah, I understand that, but then how should I intervene? To me, it seemed obvious that if you understood something, it should lead to practical action. I mean, that's what we're here. People can talk to anybody, but the idea would be that as a therapist, there should be some practical application of theory. This seemed obvious to me. And one time in supervision, a teacher said to me, well, John, you have to realize psychotherapy is an art. Well, if he'd seen inside my head, he would have seen a volcano explode, because that week I was playing with the National Symphony, playing a Mahler symphony. I knew about art, and I realized this guy has no idea what art is.
Which symphony?
The National Symphony here in Washington, D.C. And he had no idea what art was. He had no idea. In any art, there's very specific advice. It's not like people gathering in a park downtown, beating on some bongo drums together, right? So at that point, I realized I really want to learn how to teach psychotherapy, the way my father taught blacksmithing and the way my music teachers taught music. I realized there was a really big problem in the field. And so I wrote my first book, Psychodynamic Psychotherapy, because I realized we had a psychoanalytic psychotherapy training program, and people were coming out of it. They didn't really know how to hear transference systematically. They didn't know how to do classic Anna-Freud defense analysis. They didn't know how to hear conflict. And I realized, oh, that's because we don't actually have a book that shows exactly how to do that. So then as I learned Istdp, I mean, it was just radical, to be learning this new method that was so helpful and also quite complex. But I began to realize there was a really big problem, is that, you'd hear something from this person or that person. You could read Davinow's books, and even, I've studied Davinow's books before. And he has, of course, there's a lot of brilliant stuff in there, but it was and I remember, and I even, I was in training with him, but I realized it was sort of like somebody had taken a 1,000-piece puzzle and just tossed the pieces out on the table. And you were supposed to figure out how that puzzle fit together. And so some people would pick up this piece or that piece and they would focus on this, or someone else would focus on that or whatever. But there was no really coherent way of putting this together as a coherent picture. So you could see how all these concepts and techniques formed an interrelated system of meaning that made sense as a whole. And so I realized once I was starting to teach Istdp in Europe, this would have been 2007, I realized I've got to do something here, because now that I'm teaching in Europe, I really need to do. So then I started writing chapters of the book, so that, the first one was on psychodiagnosis, right? How to use the triangle of conflict, right?
Yeah.
And then just writing various chapters, and then eventually it came together as a book. But really it was a way to try to see, how do we put together everything he said, fit it into a pattern. He was trained by analysts to use psychoanalytic theory, but by the time I was studying with him, he'd say psychoanalysis is crap, it's just another form of cognitive therapy. So then a lot of people thought, oh, it's crap, so we don't need to know psychoanalytic theory. Well, no, actually you do.
Wow.
But I realized that it needed to be put in a way that would be understandable to anyone who had no previous psychoanalytic knowledge. So one of the things I did with the book is I ran it through a software that would eliminate all jargon. And I also learned through software that it could be read by anyone with a high school education. You can do all kinds of things with software. And like my last book, I wrote so that it's readable with a 6th grade education, because it's so complex.
Wow.
So it was really, how do we introduce this model of therapy as a coherent theory with techniques of follow through, and just illustrating, how do we think clinically with these concepts? How do we think clinically with our techniques? How do we develop a deeper understanding of the person so that our approach makes sense? And how do we test hypotheses? How do we know if we're right or wrong?
Yeah, wow. So it's really...
I have a question.
Go.
First of all, your book is amazing, and you really, I don't find it only technical, but also philosophical, and also it has art in it, because you take these concepts which are really difficult, and you make them understandable, like even like the super ego, for example, or other concepts. But I wonder, do you get sometimes, because it's so, when I read it, it seems so easy, but when you go to the clinical phase, it's very difficult. Do you get stuck sometimes?
Of course, every therapist gets stuck. I mean, the very best therapists are succeeding between 70 and 80% of the time. Nobody's succeeding all the time. Sure, everybody gets stuck. And like you say, yes, the theory is simple, but the application is complex, because there's a range of patients. And the triangle of conflict occurs in all patients, of course. But then, it's very different if you have a fragile patient who's splitting and projecting and losing reality testing some of the time. That's very different from a patient who's in isolation of affect and able to detach and resist emotional contact. Totally different kind of treatment. And that's one thing people learn as you're doing Istdp. Istdp is really a set of principles. It's a way of understanding. It's kind of a meta theory, you might say. And within Istdp, then we have different formats of therapy. We have this standard format that Davino wrote about with highly resistant patients. We have a graded format for patients who get really depressed and somatize and experience conversion. And then we have a very graded format for fragile patients who split and project and lose reality testing. So, I mean, wow, it's like, oh, I thought there was just one thing I needed to do. And then you realize, no, you have to tailor your work to these different capacities.
Right.
And also, if you come from some other mode of therapy where you just listen to the patient talk, it's like, wow, I'm having to develop this skill. Did the patient just offer a feeling anxiety defense? Okay, how do I come back to a therapeutic focus? And learning to maintain a therapeutic focus is oftentimes very difficult for therapists if they've been trained for a while, where you just kind of listen and just hope things work out.
Right. Well, because I also watched your videos, which are also amazing, and you talked about how you tailor, and I was really amazed how you are different. You can be with a resistant patient in one mode, and with a very fragile one or very dependent, like you're very soft. Suddenly, a really soft aspect of yourself is shown.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in a way, you know, some people say, well, this is the way I am. And you say, no, that's just your favorite habit. You know, it's like, if I'm an instrument, how do I titrate my presence and my dosage so it's optimal for the patient, right? And so you've seen like one case where I can be really very firm with a highly resistant patient, and yet very delicate and low key with a fragile patient, right? Because their affect tolerance is so low. So I think therapists oftentimes think, well, this is my personality. This is how I am. He says, no, it's not how you are, but it's a customary way that you manage feelings and anxiety and you present yourself. And so part of our task as therapists to realize, well, I have a theory about who I am. It's a concept, but I'm having to, how do I use myself as an instrument? How do I adjust to patient capacity? And then as a result, form an alliance that would be workable with this patient. Yeah, because you have some people that they can be very confrontive, but they can't work with a fragile patient. And you can have some people that are kind of fragile themselves and they work pretty well with fragile patients, but they can't work with a highly resistant patient, right? So it's how do I use myself in a way that's flexible and optimal with a broad range of patients? I mean, when we start out, we always hope we just find one way of working and it'll work with everyone. And then it's like, oh, no, it doesn't work that way. This has become a lot more complex than I'd hoped for.
John, I wanted
to... And you can understand too why certain therapy models become very popular, right? You learn one technique and that's just the technique you use, right? Their therapy really becomes kind of a form of ritualism, really. It's just, I have my technique and I'm sticking to it. And if it doesn't work, well, we'll just say the patient's not treatable.
Yeah, but there is this like tension, because in your book, like Omri said, of course, it's not only technical, but we are focused on feelings. But as you are saying now, like there are like 100 ways and more to do that work. That is not just one way to be focused on feeling. But I heard you say a few times, like you talked about Freud, and you talked about him as an active therapist. So it's really interesting for me to hear you talk about what happened to psychotherapy that needed Istdp, like to remind her about the active therapist, and also through Istdp, like from the 60s, I think, or the 70s until now, it's something that is very, I found it's very, how do you say, it's like an obstacle to therapists to be active. So really interesting. What's your thought about that?
Yeah, well, I think it's very interesting. I mean, Freud was quite active. He was he spoke a lot in therapy. He was very engaged. And when you read the autobiographies of people who were in therapy with him, that's very much what you'll hear. I think, you know, in the United States, there was a big concern that psychoanalysis appeared to be quite medical and scientific. So Freud was mistranslated in English using all kinds of very weird pseudo-scientific words to make it seem scientific. And here it became that they had the idea of neutrality. They thought neutrality meant the therapist should simply be really silent and not say much. so it became a bit of a stereotype, really, analysis in the United States became, for a while, became a stereotype of that really had little to do with Freud. Also, people misread Freud. You know, in his 1923 paper, The Ego and the Id, basically what he's saying is that initially I thought people would say what comes to mind, right? The talking pure. And he says, what I learned is that doesn't work.
Yeah.
People say what comes to mind all the time, doesn't go anywhere, right? You go to every bar, you would think, if you're saying comes to mind does a job, every bar would have cured the United States, you know, 50 years ago by now. But what he was talking about, what he meant by saying what comes to mind, he says, can the patient speak freely to a difficult topic? That's what he really meant by free association, not does the patient freely blather about everything.
Yeah. Right.
So in 1923, he was saying, you know, if you just let the patient talk, he says, really nothing's going to happen because they talk freely about a difficult topic, they get anxious, and then they're going to use a defense. And that's why he said in 1923, we really have to shift to addressing defenses. So that, because the defenses are preventing the patient from speaking freely about difficult topics. Anna Freud, when she, 1936, came out with her Ego Mechanisms Defense, basically the book was saying, hey, look, guys, you didn't listen to what my dad said in 1923. So let's just repeat this. You've got to address defenses, otherwise the patient can't speak freely about difficult issues. And so then, yeah, things took off. And so, yes, and now in psychoanalytic literature, you will find literature where people talking about that you have to have a good therapeutic focus. You have to be clear about what that focus is. But for a while, it was lost.
Yeah. Do you see Istdp as a humanistic approach?
How do you mean? What would that mean?
Because I see it as a humanistic approach, and I see it like there's you put an emphasis about the free will of the patient, and I really when you take an objective stance, like you don't when the patient doesn't want to be helped or healed or cured, I don't know, you stay in an objective stance, and you want him to get to be more involved in therapy.
Yeah, well, this, Davenlo's idea is the patient's will has to be the engine of therapy, right? And this really comes from Otto Will, who was part of Freud's inner circle, right? Otto Will wrote this book, Will Therapy, and this was his thing, is that will has to be the driver of therapy, and that's why you have to spend so much time addressing patients' will, how they'll project will, how they'll kind of will against what they think you're wanting, and how you have to deactivate all projection of will, make sure it's really the patient's wish to do this. It's so essential. In my book, Co-Creating Safety, I have an entire chapter just on the issue of will, because in fragile patients, this is oftentimes central. If they've been traumatized, oftentimes the essence of trauma is a parent saying, I don't care what you want, I want to abuse you, I want to molest you, right? So much of trauma is really, I don't care about what you want, you have to serve my want. So it shouldn't be a surprise that when we're working with fragile patients, oftentimes their ability to say what they want is really underdeveloped. It's quite impaired, and it has to be restored.
Yeah, that's a great thought.
John, you talked about how Freud was translated or misunderstood by. So, do you think also there is something about Davenlo that is misunderstood, like in the field of the, of the EDT, like from all the approaches that came through Davenlo, like ADP, Istdp, IEDP, and EFT, and so on. What's your thoughts about that?
Well, it's the fate of any thinker to be misunderstood, right?
Yeah.
Freud is widely misunderstood. Think of Rogers, right? Rogers is wildly misunderstood, right? People think of him as just kind of super empathy and go with anything. No, he could be tough as nails with certain people, right? So every great thinker ends up being misunderstood and according to certain stereotypes and emotional needs of people. They're always far more complex than the reductionistic versions that people come up with. So yeah, sure. I think many people had trouble with Davenlu because when they were watching his work, it was work with highly resistant patients. He's addressing resistance. Murderous rage comes up, and then you have some people, you know, who would say, well, that's really aggressive, or they would say like, this doesn't pay attention to positive feelings. It only pays attention to rage. I don't think rage is necessary. And so, you know, there are different people I can think of who have said they don't think it's necessary to explore rage, right? I think anytime you say that there's any part of human experience that is excluded, that should be a red flag, right? Going back to Omri's point, I mean, if this is truly a therapy for humans, that there should really be no human experience alien to therapy. It's not like, okay, I'll do all these feelings, but not that one or not that one. Instead of like, any human experience gets explored here, is understood here. We may not like a particular feeling, we may feel uncomfortable with it, but our task is to address any feeling, no matter what. So when people say, I don't think it's necessary to look at rage or whatever, to me, if I saw it in a patient, I'd be interested in the role of splitting and denial in the patient's functioning. And if we're uncomfortable with rage, we say, I don't need to deal with it, then I'd have to be wondering, what are my defenses right now that are warding off that experience? Because my defenses now are going to shape my therapy, or in that case, could even shape my theory. And then you'll end up with manic fantasies, like if you're just warm enough, defenses will melt. That's not true. We've all tried to be really warm with people, and their defenses don't just go away. See, again, that's like assuming that love is omnipotent. I mean, anyone's been around enough has seen many times how love is definitely not omnipotent. So, and it's a very understandable fantasy. We all wish that if we're just nice enough or loving enough, that yes, that it would be that we would have magic through love, right? These fantasies, of course, are very understandable. Most of us, in fact, entered the field with kind of a folk concept that if we're just really warm enough and nice enough, patients will get better, right? And that's an understandable folk concept. And then, of course, through our training, we begin to understand the complexity of conflict and realize that our work is going to be quite a bit more complicated. So I think that, you know, he was misunderstood in that way. And also people were very troubled by the fact that murderous rage had come up. But it must be a very important experience, because every day we read in the paper about murderous rage around the world, right? Crime and so on. We look at kids playing in a sandbox. So many people get murdered in those sandboxes every day.
Right.
Yeah. So, you know, and why is that? And it's because for the infant and the child, right, they're struggling with anger because they're angry with people they love. Yeah. And I think that's oftentimes what people forget. It's really about being angry with people you love. It's not that you just feel split off rage, and we're obviously not trying to help people become psychopaths who feel only pure rage. We're helping people with a very understandable conflict, being angry with people they love. And for the infant, if I'm angry with someone I love, that could threaten my survival, right? So I better use defenses. So yeah, I think, yes, he's been misunderstood in those ways. Now, did he have his own psychological difficulties? Was he difficult as a person? Sure, yep. But again, I think here too, there's a tendency in our field that if you can find neurosis in the founder, that you can write off a theory, but they're separate. Freud had his own neurotic difficulties, but still a very powerful and very useful theory. And I'm sure if we got to know Aaron Beck, he probably had some neurotic difficulties, but it doesn't mean we're going to dismiss some of the very useful techniques and so on that he came up with. So I think it's, you know, sort of like if you can devalue the man, it's an ad hominem argument, right? If I can attack the person, find the neurotic, well, then I can dismiss their theory. So But these are just, these are kind of the ways of children. They come up on our field all the time, and it doesn't matter who the thinker is. I've heard, Freud devalued, Davenport devalued, Carl Rogers devalued, these are all great thinkers, right?
Yeah.
So.
I have another question, because Yuval is now translating your book to Hebrew, and we're welcoming you to the Israeli society, and probably you have many experiences with different cultures and different people from other countries. Do you see differences because maybe feelings is universal, but do you see like your technique has to adapt to different cultures?
Well, I wouldn't say the technique so much has to adjust, but your understanding is informed by unique cultural situations. So, for example, in Scandinavia, if you're going to understand the Scandinavian superego, you have to know about Yantala. There is this book written in the early 20th century called "The Fugitive Who Crossed His Tracks." And in the book is basically about a town superego. And they had the 10 commandments of the town. You're no better than anyone else. Any thought you've had, other people already said. So it's really the 10 commandments of Yanta were really just the Scandinavian superego. So, and you begin to see that pattern, right? And it's a little different than you might find in other countries. So to work with Scandinavians, yeah, you really need to know about Yantalao. When I first taught in Poland, the students oftentimes didn't see projection. They just didn't see it. But then I had to realize, wait a second, this is a country that in 1804 was divided up between other countries. So they lived under other countries. Poland actually didn't exist from 1804 to 1919, right? So they were under the Russians, under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, under the Prussians. After World War I, suddenly it gets to exist for about 20 years, and then it's taken over by the Nazis. And then it's taken over by the Soviets. So basically, it's a country where for 200 years, it was actually quite adaptive to be paranoid. There were secret police, right? So actually being paranoid and projecting was actually an adaptive response to a political order. So when I was first working with them, which would be, less than 20 years after the fall, after they'd become a democracy, you still had kind of a cultural, you might say cultural defense that was still dissolving. Things are different now than they were when I first taught there 14 years ago, but still, it was very understandable. Yes, projection would be adaptive in a place that had been basically a police state for about 200 years. So it's very interesting understanding those things. Or the superego can take the form of the idealization of suffering, where people's masochism, they could pervert Christianity to fit their masochism. And so it would not be Christianity, but they could pervert it to fit their masochism, and you have the idealization of suffering coming up, So you have these very interesting ways it takes place, or in India where girls are frequently sexually abused because in families, children are not related to as persons sometimes, really just as kind of pieces of property that should just simply obey. It's a very, in certain parts of India, it's a very patriarchal culture. So you end up with people who are very skillful at hiding their separate will. You can have certain people where they're very, very compliant, and you just have to be very delicate because they're so attuned to just figuring out what is the will of the patriarch, right?
Right.
And there's a kind of compliance and projection of will that's quite a bit more frequent there and more severe and accepted in patients in isolation of affect than you would find, for instance, in the United States.
Yeah. And also, I'm continuing this, but like I know anger is a feeling that some cultures and also some people are very ashamed to feel, and they're very hard. It's very hard to express it. And do you have like thoughts about that?
Well, you also have cultural expression, right? And this is also, I remember Davenley would show a case where a patient was having an unlocking of guilt. He was a British fellow. And Davenley would say, so you see that unlocking of guilt? And all of us kind of looking weird. You know, because this guy, I mean, you just didn't, this guy did not look any different whatsoever, right? And he says, oh, notice a tear in his eye. Oh, yeah. So, and you know, where the cultural expression of emotion is much more restricted, yeah, you don't expect to see a huge expression. Whereas, you know, if I have treating a patient from Italy, right? Yeah, it'll be quite dramatic.
Right.
Alan Abbas talks about this because he, in his medical rotation, you know, he's initially in a family doc, right? So he was working for a while in the obstetrics ward where they're, you know, giving birth, women are giving birth, you know, and you might have someone from Canada or Scandinavia, and the woman say, and then and then you'd have someone, an Italian woman, she'd be yelling. And then you might have someone who's like from the Middle East, and it would just be all over the place, you know? So again, I think that's also true that there's not only affect, which is universal, but you have cultural rules of expression. And so that's also important because you might be working with someone where you're expecting a huge dramatic breakthrough, but you know, it might be a very deeply felt one, but the expression may be more muted.
Thank you for
and not to worry about that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
John, you talk about the deliberate practice. You also have a website, right, about deliberate practice. And I wonder, how do you see the field of psychotherapy? You see it going to like an expertise or more like a scientific approach regarding what we talked about, also like the free association part? What do you think? Where do you think psychotherapy is headed in that way?
Well, the problem is there's not an accepted conceptual framework that's accepted widely in our field. You know, in nuclear physics, everyone understands, you know, quantum theory, theory of relativity. There's an agreement on that. In medicine, those are agreed upon theories. In the psychotherapy field, we don't have that agreement on a conceptual framework. So we have certain kinds of models, you know, in the field of psychotherapy that really have a conceptual framework that guides clinical thinking and for which developmental skills would make sense. So any kind of psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, you know, but, you know, we have literally hundreds of other pseudo models where there's no theory, and so there's no need to have clinical thinking. And I think as a result, what I see here and what I think is going to continue is that we're going to have a number of pseudo models, pseudo scientific models that will continue to come up and attract an audience, and we'll have other genuine models that will be continue to be a little bit more empirical, where there's going to be a lot more emphasis on skills, the measurement of skills, the analysis of learning skills and the impact it has on outcome. But I do see that I think we're going to have kind of a continuing bifurcation in the field for a while because of the politics, basically. And when you don't have an agreed upon theory, there's no way to have agreement on clinical thinking skills and everything else. Because, you know, the learning of skills, which I think is essential, it's just like in music and any other art or craft, you have to learn skills. But there's tremendous bias against learning skills. And also when we do skill building exercises, they're hard. We're making mistakes in front of other people and it feels really embarrassing and it's difficult. You know, most of the time when people go to graduate school, they have to read books. That's easy. They can just talk in class. That's also easy. They can cram and pass a test. That's easy, right? And so they come away thinking, it's going to be easy to be a psychotherapist because my graduate training, in essence, was easy. And since you never actually had to demonstrate skills, you never had to make mistakes with skills in front of everyone else, we in the field, we end up with overconfidence. I mean, the literature shows something like 80% of people think they're in the top 25% of therapists, right? We have tremendous overconfidence in the field. And so, or like students come in, they say, well, I know how to listen, right? Well, they know how to listen to manifest content. They don't know how to listen to conflict and manifest content. They don't know how to listen to process. They don't know how to listen to latent content. They don't know how to listen to countertransference. They don't know how to combine those perspectives to come up with a more coherent understanding of the patient, and so on, right? So they assume the word listening, the folk concept, is the same as the psychological concept. So they tend to be quite overconfident because they have no idea what's actually going, what skills are involved. And of course, they're not taught in graduate school. So when and if they do skill building, they really don't like it because they're making mistakes. They're not good at it. It doesn't feel good. So I think too, that we're going to end up with a group. It'll be a somewhat smaller group of people who really work at skills, and they will become a lot more effective. And you'll have people who won't. And that you also see that in the literature. About 20% of therapists are getting 80% of the good results.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The people who do skill building are going to be part of that 20%.
Mm-hmm.
And that 20% will expand incrementally. 38% of therapists are consistently unhelpful. Mm-hmm. But that's a fault of training, right? If you don't teach people the skills they need, they're going to be unhelpful.
Also, what I want to ask you about the supervision process, I heard one of your lectures when you talked about like a micro view to this process of supervision. When a therapist is said, oh, I didn't do this right, or I didn't interview in the right way. So you just, okay, so what would you do now? Mm-hmm. So, and then he'd go to punish himself. But I did it. Okay. So, but if you do it now, so I find it really, really compassion, like a lot.
Absolutely. And if the student continues, I say, wait a second, you forgot the first rules of supervision. And they say, what's that? Remember, the first rule is, first, I get to criticize you. Then you get to criticize yourself. And then we do it together. And you know what we call that? True love. True love. Because you see, oftentimes teachers think they're responsible to point out mistakes and tell students what to do. No, a mistake is really a learning opportunity, right? When a student makes a mistake, the teacher needs to be thinking, okay, what did the student see? What didn't the student see? And so what are the questions I can ask so I can help them see what they didn't see? And then what are questions I can ask that will help them think their way to the answer, right? It might be something very simple. They say, oh, rather than point out they made a mistake, I may say, okay, good. And so when the patient said, I think this has to do with my ex-wife, right? Would that be the problem that he wants help with? Would it be anxiety in the body, or would it be a defense? A defense. Good, yeah, right. And so in that defense, since he was thinking, that'd be intellectualization. So how could you invite the patient to look underneath the thought and come back to the focus, right? So you don't tell them what to do. You just ask questions. So because students see, if you give answers, you're the one who's doing the thinking. You need to ask questions, so they're doing the thinking, because really they have to learn how to think. It's like that old adage, you can give a person a fish, they eat for a day. You teach them to fish, they live for a lifetime, right? So if you give them an answer, they have an answer for that moment with that patient. But if you teach them how to think to the answers, then they're learning the process of psychodiagnosis that will allow them to work with lots of patients. So it's that understanding that mistakes aren't problems. For us, it's fantastic. So, oh, now you've let me know where you need help. This is where you need help. But then also to understand that in your helping, that you're going to do it through questions, so that instead of you doing the thinking, the student is learning what are the sequence of questions one asks in order to psychodiagnose a patient.
Such a big change, like in the process of thinking about the process of healing and the process of psychotherapy in that way. It really is It's great. Wow.
Yeah, because it's not your job to tell a student they did something wrong. As a supervisor, you have to have a theory of the student's mind. What do they see? What don't they see? What are they able to think about, right? The other day, a student says to his patient, so I want you to tell me what the problem is that you'd like me to help you with. And so I said to him, and so whose desire is leading the therapy right now? Right.
Yeah.
So, and right. And now you mentioned that this patient is coming to you because he tends to submit to people, right? So, so if your desire is driving that, how would it relate to his presenting problem? So how would you need to do pressure to the problem in a way where you're not supporting his habit of submission?
Good question.
Right. And so then, right. Well, and that, okay, you just made a statement, right? So what does that encourage? Right. So what would be a question you could ask? Yeah. So you find out what the problem is that he wants to work on. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right.
The internal.
I still don't have the question. I'm still thinking.
So,
right.
But
it gives you a sense of the questioning process that you go through in supervision, so that because a lot of times people just give them the answer, and so people have a bunch of answers, but they don't know how it fits together. It's just like they have a bunch of puzzle pieces, but they don't see how this fits together.
Yeah, this is something that you really emphasize when, like, in your last seminar. It was really really assess what is in front, like Alan Abbas is talking about, what is in the front, like when we have anxiety, we have defense, we have feeling, and we work on that. But also, as Omri said, this is so complex and really a craft to master, like an art to really practice. And
right, and also building understanding in the student, like when you ask, right, so if your desire is driving the room, defense, how would that be related to the patient's presenting problem, his typical transference, right? You're actually teaching the student how to see pattern, how to think about how two concepts relate to one another. So in a way, you're building a more complex understanding in the student by asking him to think about those links and figure it out.
So also, John, after you wrote Co-Creating Change, and I wonder when did you came about writing Co-Creating Safety, and did you feel like there is a more need to really structure the safety aspect of psychotherapy, and especially in fragile patients?
Actually, what got me started on the book is I was talking to a very close friend of mine, and he said, you really ought to write a book on fragile patients. You really know that population, and blah, 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 blah. That was really what kind of got it going. So I was probably susceptible because I was having a very nice glass of Cabernet. So that probably
the best way
weakened me and just got. So that's what I also felt. He also felt like Davin, wrote all his writing as actually on highly resistant patients and isolation of affect. And I realized that in our Istdp community, we really didn't have a really coherently spelled out theory of fragility that put all these pieces together. I mean, you'd hear something from one person or another, but no one had really put it together, linked it to the theory, and showed some of the history of the concepts and how it relates, across the literature, and put it together into a synthetic whole. And also talked about levels of fragility, the thresholds, and all that. So yeah, I felt that was really an important thing. I mean, people obviously build on that in the future, but I thought it was important to get this together in one place so they could understand that it's a very different population, why it's different, how you work with it, and what are the key concepts that you need. Now, that's a complicated book, I have to say.
Right.
Yeah. So, Omri, you want to ask something else?
Just about the intensive short term. Do you feel that in fragile patients that the short term is longer, like you need more time?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that's literature shows the more disturbed the patient is, the longer the therapy they need. That's across all modalities. Yeah. It's just the more disturbed. I mean, the more greater disturbance, it makes sense, the longer time it would take. Davenlou's idea is that fragile patients would need 50 to 150 sessions. Sometimes it takes longer than that. You know, it really depends on the level of disturbance.
And you think that the less, the sound here, you think that the less skilled the therapist is, then the longer the therapy is. Also, it's
Sure. Yeah. Because you're the less skilled we are, the more of the time we're lost. Yeah. I mean, we've all had that experience.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on here, and I'm going another week not knowing what to do. And, oh my God, I'm so glad nobody has seen this session right now. You know, it's just, I mean, when I think how my work was, 30, 40 years ago, my work is vastly more efficient now than it was then. Yeah. My hope is that I can help students become much more efficient, much more earlier in the career than I did, so they don't have to suffer as long.
You are helping a lot, really a lot. Really appreciate all you do for the field. Really appreciate your time. It's very generous of you. And I hope the translation of the book will be out soon. And also co-creating safety in 2022, hopefully.
Yeah.
And again, thank you very much, John.
Thank you very, very, very much.
Looking forward to host you in an upcoming webinar. Will be an honor.
I look forward to that as well.
Great, John. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thank you. Best wishes, and I'll see you very soon. Take care.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.